The American Egyptian Women of Influence podcast aims to be the American Egyptian culture podcast of choice. We believe that our knowledge and our participants' stories will greatly enhance understanding of both cultures. I'm Karen Lake Aburaya. Pauline Kaldas was born in Cairo and came to the United States with her parents in 1969 when she was 8 years old. She grew up in Boston and earned a PhD in English and creative writing, then taught at Roger Williams College, Rhode Island School of Design, American University in Cairo, Binghamton, and for the past 20 years at Hollins University in Roanoke, Virginia. Her American husband, T.J. Anderson, also teaches at Hollins and at one point taught at Cairo University as a Fulbright scholar. Pauline has also written memoirs, essays, short stories, poetry, and edited anthologies. Welcome, Pauline. Glad to have you with us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
I mention your husband because both of your teaching positions have taken you back and forth several times between Egypt and the U.S. And in the front of your book, Looking Both Ways, you quote the Haitian-American author Edwidge Danticat, referring to seeing the world with two eyes that do not always look in the same direction. And you're nodding. Is that what it feels like to you going back and forth between America and Egypt?
Oh, that's a great question. I love that quote from Edwidge Danticat, and I really wanted to use it in the book because it does have so much to do with what it means to be from more than one single place. And I think even when you're not traveling back and forth, you're always looking at the world with two sets of eyes, looking in different directions. And in some way or another, trying to make sense of that. In other words, your vision is, I think, larger than that single perspective. And it does, I think, also signify what it means to go back and forth, at least for me. I think wherever you are, you feel like you're at the center of the world. And so when I'm in Egypt, it feels like Egypt is the center of the world. And when I'm in the United States, it feels like the United States is at the center of the world. But that doesn't mean that I'm not keenly aware that there are other centers that coexist at the same time.
Now, you've been in the U.S. since you were a little girl, but do you sometimes still feel more Egyptian than American?
Oh, yes. It's incredible. That just does not leave you. Also, I think having comment, I was 8.5 when we came. And I think being 8 years old is a very particular moment in a child's life. It's when you're still responding to the world very emotionally and intuitively and instinctively, but also your intellect is forming and you're beginning to sort of make sense of the world that you live in and how things work. So I think it was a particularly significant moment in my life that I came to the U.S. Also, I had and still do and kept very clear memories of those first 8 years of my life. So I did step outside of my family's life to go to school and to be in the American world, but the Egyptian world was still very much a part of my life. So yes, there are moments when I still feel a little, I guess, out of place within the US, especially when someone makes a reference to pop culture and I'm like, I have no idea what they're talking about. And then I sort of, instead of feeling bad, I kind of remind myself, well, if I talked about, an Egyptian musician, they wouldn't know what I was talking about. So
what do you think you offer your creative writing students because of your Egyptian and immigrant background?
I always try to encourage my students to explore who they are and where they have come from, and to really interrogate those spaces that have formed their identity, and think about how they see the world as a result of that. So I think that's one thing that I try to offer them is the space to do that exploration if they want to. I think really emphasize language. I think being bilingual means that I am always aware that there's more than one way to say something. And one of the things I love most about being a writer is playing with language, manipulating it, seeing how far you can stretch it. And so I also try to encourage my students to do that. Many students, even though their primary language is English, might speak more than one type of English if they have, a regional identity or a cultural identity where English is spoken differently. So that's another thing I really try to get my students to look at and to use in their writing.
You mentioned, going a little further on this, you mentioned in your bio for Hollins that you approach literature from both an intimate and scholarly perspective. How do you do that? And explain a bit about that difference.
So much of what I teach, particularly in literature, is multicultural literature. And so I do teach classes on Arab American literature, but I also teach multicultural women writers, immigrant literature that bring together a selection of books from various cultures. And I think for me, there's an intimate relationship with all of this literature that I teach because it speaks in many ways to my own sense of identity and my own experiences. As an immigrant, I don't just connect with Arab American texts about immigration, but I also connect to other texts. A book like The Namesake by Jhumpa Lahiri most definitely speaks to me with that sense, particularly of the parents in that book and the way that they exist between cultures. And so I think so many of these books that I teach, I do approach them as someone who participates in the community that these books are talking about. And I try to impart that to my students, that not only can we approach these books from a scholarly and critical way of how are they working, how are they being put together, what ideas and themes and symbols and images and all of those things, but we can also approach them as intimate readers where we're entering into a world that speaks to us in some way. And so one of the ways I do that is I encourage students to write both critical essays but also creative types of assignments so that they have an opportunity to respond in a more personal and creative way to the literature.
You mentioned in one essay that for some immigrants, the thread that ties them to Egypt has become a thin sliver too invisible to follow back, which is a beautiful phrase. But you seem to have been very focused on not letting that happen to you.
That is true. It's hard to imagine, but when I was 8 years old, I did not know what America was. I lived an insular, I had a happy childhood, and we lived with my grandmother and my aunt, so I lived within an extended family unit. I did not want to come here. I did not understand why we were coming here at that age, and I missed my family very much, and especially my grandmother, with whom I was really close. And so I think holding on to that became very important for me, and essential for me to not lose it, because losing it would have been like losing my family. We went back once when I was about 15 years old for a brief visit. But then when I had the opportunity to go back in 1990 and teach at the American University in Cairo, that experience was really what I had been seeking throughout my life. And living there for 3 years, teaching at the university, reconnecting with my extended family, I remembered everyone that we had, left behind. And I felt like they had sort of saved a place for me, like I still had a place within my family, within my community. And so for me, holding on to that thread has been really essential. And also holding on to it, I hope, so that my children can sort of follow it back. We've taken them back to Egypt several times. They're connected with some of their cousins there. And my hope is that they will remain connected throughout their lives as well.
Well, we thank you very much. We're very glad you found a place in the United States, and we'll keep looking for your new books and your new thoughts. Thank you very much, Pauline.
Thank you very much. Thanks.